For millions of years, mankind took birth and life for granted. But somewhere, profound insights regarding the nature of our existence dawned upon an ancient people, the people of India.
Indian knowledge system has three words there: Indian knowledge and system.
प्रकृति से संस्कृति बनाना, this is the task for human being.
India was the prosperous place in the world. Why?
How did India's knowledge survive while other ancient civilizations disappeared?
The whole world is talking about sustainability. If you look at the Sanskrit word dharma, the very meaning of dharma is that which can be held or sustain.
विना संस्कृतम नैव संस्कृति. इंडिया को जानना है, इंडियन कल्चर जानना है, तो संस्कृत जाननी होगी.
Most stories are about lost civilizations. This is about a living one. Namaskar, good evening. Welcome to Unfiltered with Prachyam Live. Tonight on Prachyam, we take up one of the most debated and misunderstood topic of discussion about Indian civilization: caste versus Varna. The word caste has been made a reason to target our society. It is one of the reasons for the increasing Hindu phobia around the world. And this word caste has been exploited majorly by many political parties in India for their own vested interest. Was the caste system that we understand today actually same as the ancient Indian concept of Varna? How was Varna understood in the Vedic period? How did it evolve over time? And how much of our modern understanding has been shaped by colonial interpretations? To explore these questions, we have with us an academic scholar of Indian civilization, post colonial thought, and Indian psychology, a professor at Sophia University, California, president of the Cultural Integration Fellowship, San Francisco, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Civilizational Studies. He's an author of several books examining Indian thought, post colonial discourse, and representation of Hinduism, and has presented his research extensively at academic conferences in India and abroad. And that special guest on our show tonight is Professor Kundan Singh. Namaskar, Professor Kundan Singh ji. A very warm welcome to you on our show. And before we begin, let me tell you, viewers, this is one of the first episodes of this series of podcasts that we will be doing on this most important topic. Thank you so much, Professor Kundan Singh, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Praveenji, for inviting me, and namaskar to all your viewers.
So, as I said, this is the very, very important topic that I thought, we should discuss about. We should clear all misconceptions around this. There have been so many distorted narratives about caste, about Varna. There's no clear understanding, and many people around the world, including Indian politicians, have exploited it against us. So I would like you to explain, before we really go deep into it, what is the difference between Varna and caste?
It's $1 million question, so thank you very much. The difference is massive. And let me state at the very outset that the understanding that I'm going to share with you comes to me from the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, they represent the Rishi tradition, and the very folk and common understanding in India even today is that whatever comes from either the mouth or the hand of a rishi is a shastra. So, of course, Sri Aurobindo wrote most of his things in English, and it is from there that I'm deriving my knowledge and sharing with you and your viewers. He has encapsulated what is going to unfold very beautifully in his work called The Foundations of Indian Culture. It has been renamed as Renaissance in India and other essays, and it can be procured from the Sri Aurobindo Ashram. Now, even when Sri Aurobindo was writing about this topic, it was a misunderstood topic, and I believe he took the opportunity of allaying the misconceptions. And in order to allay the misconceptions, he takes us back to the Vedic age, when this system was conceptualized to begin with. And in order to understand the system, it is very important that we understand the gunas, the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, once again, which are very commonly used in folk India from north to south and east to west. It's a different thing that these concepts are not part of the academic culture. But these gunas, they inform the Indian living even today in many different ways, and they have been discussed quite significantly in Sankhya. Sankhya also gives us the manifestation story. And when I say manifestation, I am deliberately using this term because the Indian civilization, the Indian tradition, has not spoken about creation, it has spoken about manifestation. The divine has manifested itself into the world. There are some traditions that talk about Brahm specifically. There are others that talk about Shakti, and there are some others that talk about both Brahm as well as Shakti. The manifestation story in Sankhya is very long, but to cut the long story very short and just remain focused on the gunas, the story is that Purusha and Prakriti, before manifestation, were at rest and were not in contact with each other. They came in contact, and the equilibrium of Prakriti got disturbed. Prakriti essentially is composed of three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And the moment this equilibrium got disturbed, the manifestation began. So one of the first steps, or one of the first stages in the manifestation, was that Mahat came into existence. It can be very loosely translated, as cosmic intelligence, if you will. And once again, I'm underlying this phrase when I say this. Now, this very Mahat manifests in human beings as buddhi, which is the discerning faculty in us, the discriminating faculty in us. Out of buddhi, through the concentration of rajas, ahankar came into existence. And then there were two parallel processes that happened. On one side, through the concentration of sattva emanating out of ahankar, manas, which is another aspect of the mind or antahkaran within our traditional understanding, karmendriyas and jnanendriyas came into existence. And on the other side, the so-called the five elements, Mahabhutas and Tanmatras, came into existence. We are not going to focus on any of those, and we are just going to focus on Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, the gunas. Now, these gunas are in flux because Prakriti in manifestation is in flux. And every individual has the presence of these three gunas. In fact, every entity in cosmos, animate or inanimate, has the presence of these three gunas because it is basically these three gunas that have created, or you know the the universe, the cosmos that we see around us. Within the human beings, it is the predominance of a particular guna which gives certain personality traits. This is something which is very important to understand in order to understand how Varna was conceptualized to begin with. So, within this universe, within the human population, you will have certain people who will have the predominance of sattva. The predominance of sattva is going to give that individual certain personality traits. What are those personality traits? That individual essentially will seek knowledge, will seek truth, harmony, peace, all the sublime and noble things that humanity has conceptualized. This individual is going to seek the ultimate. And what is the ultimate within our tradition? The ultimate is Brahm. Now, because this individual will seek Brahm, that individual is a Brahman. That was the understanding. Then you have certain individuals who have the predominance of Rajas. The people, both men and women, who have the predominance of this particular guna is not going to seek knowledge, is not going to seek harmony, is not going to seek peace. On the contrary, what is this that the individual is going to seek? The individual is going to seek power. The individual will orient himself or herself for politics, for dominance, and so on and so forth. Then you had another category coming from the predominance of tamas. What does the predominance of tamas do within an individual? It creates certain characteristics hovering around indolence and inertia. This individual is neither going to seek knowledge nor power, and because of these tendencies or these personality traits, this individual was put in the category of Shudras. And then you had people, who had an admixture of Rajas and Tamas, and people with such a combination are oriented towards generating wealth. They essentially are wealth seekers, and they were categorized as Vaishya. Now, there's a very interesting equation that actually comes when you look at the Vedic times. What is it? The predominance of a particular guna, it creates a certain swabhava within an individual. That swabhav gives rise to the swadharma of an individual. Because once again, when you look at the Vedic cosmology, Pravinji, what was important was that every dharma had to work in tandem with Rita. So while, there are so many different kinds of dharma that have been given to the Hindu people, Swadharma was also very important. You have certain duties and responsibilities, if I may again, once again, use the term dharma very loosely, towards yourself. And therefore, it was mandated that one needed to pick up a vocation in tandem with one's swadharma. You know, what was the vocation? The vocation was karma. So, based on swadharma, your karma, your vocation, was determined, and that determined your varna. So here is this equation which comes into existence: predominance of a particular guna giving rise to swabhava, swabhava giving rise to swadharma, swadharma mandating that you pick up a vocation or karma in tandem with your swadharma, and that determined your varna. I will
Very
make,
interesting, very,
yeah.
very interesting, because now you have traced, all this to its origin, to the core, and you say that, in the process of manifestation of the unmanifested, you have taken up, predominantly the three gunas that play a very important role, and out of those three gunas, the swadharma, it comes, and then, people accordingly, they are inspired to take up, the vocation and the karma, and that is how, the one comes into existence. This is what you mean.
Yes.
Very nice. So, if it is sattva pradhan, individual, his quest will be for harmony, for peace, for anand, for bliss, for spirituality, for brahma. And you said, if it is, rajas pradhan individual, he will be looking for power, for authority. And if he is, tamas pradhan, he will be, his natural instinct will be, to work towards, accumulating wealth. These are the role of the three gunas.
Yeah. So, yes, predominance of sattva will make an individual a Brahman. Predominance of rajas will make an individual kshatriya. Predominance of uh, tamas will make an individual shudra, and an admixture of rajas and tamas will make an individual a vaishya. This was the conceptualization, and and this conceptualization very fleetingly is actually mentioned in the Rig Veda. Now, once again, when you look at the Ved, you find that within the same family, you have people living together performing different karmas, which meant that different varnas resided within the same family. And it was not mandatory. It was not mandatory for the children to pick up the karma of his or her parents. So the Varna system in the Vedic times was not hereditary. And in fact, when we talk about this, it is very important to also go into the root word of Varna. It comes from the word vri. Vri itself means to choose. So, the choice of taking up your vocation and your word was there within the Vedic times. This is something which is extremely important to realize and understand. And in fact, whenever you will go into the Shruti tradition, the Aparashaya tradition, the tradition of the rishis and the avatars, you will find that the Varna has been very closely entwined with the guna. What is it that Shri Krishna says in the Gita? Chatur Varenyam Maya Shrishtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha.
Karma, Vivekasha, yeah.
And Pravinji, it's extremely important, to lay a little bit of focus on this karma, because unfortunately there have been a lot of people in India who have given a particular kind of spin on karma. They say that it is prarabdha karma. The deeds of your past life. That uh, that determines your Varna. The entire Gita, the 18 chapters of Gita, are hovering around karma, which is work. How can, karma here begin talking about prarabdha karma? So it's a particular spin which has been given. So when you look at the Gita from the perspective that we unfolded just now, Gita also is talking about the same equation that we unpacked. That your Varn is based on the vocation that you take up, that you choose. And once this understanding becomes clear, then everything what happened afterwards begins to fall in place. So yeah. So this is this is the understanding which is coming from the Vedic world. This is the understanding which is coming from the Rishi tradition. And now,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, you're right. Bhagwan Krishna has very well explained in Bhagavad Gita itself, in the 14th chapter, about the three gunas. Very correct.
and then there are two kinds of shifts that have occurred. And it is important, to understand both the shifts, because, we just don't have one yuga, right? We have Kali Yuga as well. And we have the Shruti tradition, and then we have the Smriti tradition. So before, this entire system was badly distorted by the Britishers, it is also important that we understand, what the Smriti tradition says. And for that, I will not be going into Manusmriti, because Manusmriti is a very politicized text. But what I'm going to do is that that I'm going into Gautam Dharma Sutra. And both the emic and, or let me put it this way, ethic understanding is very convoluted. The insiders understanding, people who have studied the Dharma Shastra tradition, say that Gautam Dharma Sutra is the earliest of the extant text in the Dharma Shastra tradition. So it predates even Manusmriti. So when you go into the details of Gautam Dharma Sutra, then there are some interesting details that emerge, and it is important to look into them. What you find in the Smriti tradition is that the earlier equation that we spoke about, that gets collapsed. And when that gets collapsed, your Varna is determined by the karma you perform. No mention of Swabhava, Swadharma, and so on and so forth. That is out of the equation. Your Varna is dependent upon the karma that you perform, and that too, the karma or the vocation which your family is performing. So this was This was an understanding. This is the understanding which you get from the Smriti tradition. The Smriti tradition says that, the children of Brahmin parents will be Brahmins. The children, of and there's complexity, and we are going to unfold all the complexities here. And the reason why we are going to unfold them is because, truly speaking, forget about the politicians. Even the academics do not understand this tradition of ours. And when I say academics across the world, I do not expect that Western academics, because of their vested interest, are going to understand this tradition well. Even the Indian academics, who can get into this tradition, we know that most of them are not able to study Sanskrit, but at least they can study the translations of these texts in their mother tongue, which are also available. But it is very unfortunate that even that work does not happen, because of which what is there in the Smriti tradition also does not get represented properly. So when you come to the Smriti tradition, when Gautam Dharma Sutra onwards, you find that Varna has become hereditary. The children of Kshatriyas will be Kshatriyas, and so on and so forth. But there is a major but here, and that needs to be recognized, which is that if a particular family engages in the karma of a different Varna, the Varna of that family would change. So, as long as the Hindu civilization, the Hindu traditions have been active, Varna of an individual was never set in stone. So what is it that the Gautam Dharma Sutra says? The Gautam Dharma Sutra says that if a Brahmin family engages in the karma of a Kshatriya for 3 generations, in the 4th generation, that family or the members of that family will become a Kshatriya, They will no longer remain a Brahmin. If they engage in the karma of a Vaishya for 5 generations, then in the 6th generation, that Brahmin family would become a Vaishya. Similarly, if a Brahmin family engaged in the karma of Shudra Varna for 6 generations, in the 7th generation, that family would turn into a Shudra. And all the Smriti traditions or all the Smriti texts are united in this. They might differ here and there, in terms of, how much, how many generations one has to do the work in order for Varna to change. But Varna was always dependent on the karma which individuals and families were performing. This is something which is extremely clear. And that is why, I'll give you a very interesting example. When you look up Aine Akbari, of course, written during the times of Akbar, you find this category in your part of the world from where you come, Pravinji, which is the Banaras region, a category called Brahman Rajputs. This is as long as, or rather till a few years ago, a few centuries ago, not too long ago. So you had this category called Brahman Rajputs. Even today, in Bihar and eastern UP, you find these Bhumihar Brahmins. So basically, those Brahmins, who left the karma or the vocation of Brahmins and took up the karma of other Varnas, because of which they underwent a Varna change. Now, why these categories of people were keeping Brahmins, or Brahman appended to their Jati category? Once again, in the Smriti tradition, you find two concepts mentioned: Varnapkarsh and Varnopkarsh. Varnapkarsh, Varn Upkarsh. Varnopkarsh, Varn Upkarsh. So fundamentally, you could slide up and down the Varna order.
So it was flexible,
It was
people
very,
could.
not only this, there's more. There's more. And this is something that needs to be understood, even when we discuss the Smriti tradition. Because the Smriti tradition at this point in time in India and across the world is majorly derided without people actually looking into what the tradition is saying. Now, when you look at the Smriti traditions, and specifically Gautam Dharma Sutra, you do not find one single hierarchy, if you will. Even if we try to understand this whole system, within the binary of hierarchy and equality, which itself is a major problem, maybe not in this conversation, but a conversation going forward will unfold. There isn't one single hierarchy which actually gets discussed within the Smriti tradition. You have, let's say, for instance, the knowledge hierarchy. When you have the knowledge hierarchy, what is it that you find? You find the Brahmins at the top. Then you have the Kshatriyas. Then you have the Vaishya. Then you have the Shudra. Then you have the power hierarchy. And when you have the power hierarchy, you have the Kshatriyas at the top, Brahmins, Vaishya, Shudra. Then you have the wealth hierarchy. When you have the wealth hierarchy, you have the Vaishya at the top. Then you have Shudra. Then you have Kshatriya. Then you have Brahman. And it is very important, to take this into account. Why? Because this very tradition says that a Brahman can survive on Dan and Dan alone, whereas a Shudra has to be sumptuously paid for the work that he or she does. This understanding is very clear. So while this, you have a category of people who are preserving and disseminating knowledge which has come to the civilization from the rishis. They have to survive on the dan of the community members alone. One could not make money out of the knowledge that a Brahmin had. Wait, there is more. So I deliberately said that the Brahmins were preserving and disseminating knowledge of the civilization. And here as well, this was just about the Vedas, nothing else. Just about the Vedas and nothing else. Who were the people who were the creators of knowledge? the creators of knowledge since time immemorial in our tradition have been the rishis. And the rishis have come from all stratas, all varnas, all jatis of our society. And it is very important, that we understand this minute point as well. You, as well as many of your viewers, will be familiar with this term which is used for the yogis. Triguna Tita. And Praveenji, and this is the interesting thing. If you would ask the meaning of this term of the academics, it is highly possible that 99% of them will not be able to tell you what this means. But there will be more people within the society, at times even coming from the elite, what is considered as the illiterate strata of the society. They will be able to explain this to you. What does Trigunatit mean? Trigunatit means an individual who has gone beyond the gunas, beyond the three gunas. Why did the rishis come from all the different stratas of the society? Because any individual who has gone beyond the gunas could actually become a rishi. And it was basically your gunas that were determining your varna. जैसे ही आपका गुण का ट्रांसेंडेंस हुआ, आपके वर्ण का भी ट्रांसेंडेंस हो जाएगा. So when you have people, saying, oh, the rishis were Brahmins, somebody coming from this jati or varna and became a Brahmin. No. A rishi has no jati, has no varna, because a rishi is an individual who has gone beyond the three gunas. The moment he or she goes beyond the three gunas, varna classification does not apply on that individual. It's over. It's done with. And this also, this transcendence was gradually given to the society. And for that, we need to understand the system. Many of you, or many of your viewers will be familiar with this. It's a very common understanding that the Hindu life was divided into, 4 categories: Brahmacharya, Grihasth, Vanprasth, and Sannyas.
The 4 ashrams.
The 4 ashrams. Mm-hmm. What may not be commonly known is that after Brahmacharya, the choice of going into any of these 3 ashramas was available to an individual. So an individual after Brahmacharya could directly take sannyas. Of course, that was dependent on taking the permission from the parents and other family members. There was a caveat. But this could happen. An individual could take Vanprasth, and an individual could get into Grihastha as well. Now, your Varna classification, even during the times of the Smritis, was only applicable to you as long as you were a Brahmachari and a Grihastha. तभी तक ये applicable था. Now, the moment you step into Vanprasth or Sannyas, the Varna classification would not apply on you. most of the illiterate folk people know about this. Jati na pucho sadhu ki. In traditional India, even today, nobody asks the jati, of a sannyasi or a sadhu.
So even in Vanprasth, you said, even in Vanprasth, this never
Yes,
used to apply?
yes, because see, it's very very logical, and that is why one needs to understand how this system actually came into existence. Because the moment you enter into vanaprasth, right, or sannyas, what is it that you are doing? You have started the process of transcending your gunas. If you have started the process of transcending your gunas, the Varna category once again is not going to get applied to you. And when you look at the Smritis, what was expected of a Vanprasthi, was different from what was expected of a sannyasi. Sannyasi had to practice non-violence, or ahimsa to such an extent that he or she could not even pluck a fruit from the tree, could only eat what was on the ground as far as trees were concerned. जब परित्याग कर दिया एक पेड़ ने अपने फ्रूट्स का, तो वो सन्यासी खा सकता था, not otherwise. Whereas Vanprasthi could do. So there were stages, In sannyas, the practice became even more stringent. So, all these systems basically had a cosmology behind. And if one does not understand that cosmology, if one does not understand that paradigm, if you will, one will only end up misunderstanding the tradition. So this tradition, was extremely flexible. It was extremely nuanced, and if these nuances come to the fore, what is going on in current times in India will change quite significantly.
Very well explained, Professor Kundan Singh ji. If I may ask, from where does your understanding come, of all this? You started from Sri Aurobindo, and then, you came later on, to Vedic traditions, and then, to the Smriti traditions. If you can just tell us,
I have
specifically.
this book right in front of me. I have gone through this many different times. And when you study something, without prejudice, I'm not only talking about Gautam Dharma Sutra, anything without prejudice, without having any preconceived notion about something. The understanding which is there in the text begins to come to you. And if one has one's own sadhana, if one is connected, with the satta of truth, if you will, then the understanding begins to kind of, filter down. It begins to trickle down on its own, and you begin to get evidence. I'll quote, something here as well. In the Bhagavad Puran, for instance, it is very categorically mentioned that an individual from any Varna, if he or she has performed the grihastha duties and responsibilities well, has an equal chance of attaining moksha. And that is why, you have people taking sannyas or going to Vanprasth from all these 4 different varnas. And whoever was able to apply himself or herself properly would become a rishi. And the moment you would become a rishi, you would be worshipped by all and sundry from all the strata of the society. आज भी ऋषि के पास सब लोग जाते हैं. Nobody asks, the jati or a caste, of an individual when one goes for the darshan of a rishi. All these classifications become insignificant. So, it has come from very protracted work, Praveelji. Of course, the massive inspiration and the influence comes from the mother and Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo's yoga is integral yoga, which means that that we have to transform the world consciousness as well. It is not a yoga which says that you have to practice this yoga in a monastery or on a mountaintop. You have to do this within the society and bring about that transformation. So it is for the larger transformation. This is for the transformation of this falsehood, which has been created and disseminated by the Britishers, to which most Indians, have become influenced. I applied myself to gain this knowledge, so that I could disseminate it with this understanding, with this faith, with this Shraddha. And once again, I'm not equating Shraddha with faith here, with this Shraddha that there will come a time when the falsehood will evaporate. People will know, what this tradition was, what this tradition has been, how this tradition has undergone changes over a period of time, and what the Britishers did to distort this significantly. Because
and before we come to this, Kundan ji, how Britishers distorted, which is very important, and we want to have a very detailed discussion on this. हम चाहेंगे थोड़ा जो हमारे हिंदी भाषी जो श्रोता हैं, जो सुन रहे हैं, जो हमारे दर्शक हैं, उनके लिए हम थोड़ा सा इसको एक बार पूरा हिंदी में हम एक सहज भाषा में समझा दें. प्रोफेसर कुंदन सिंह जी ने बताया कि जो प्रकृति जब मैनिफेस्टेशन करती है, जब अपने आप को अव्यक्त से व्यक्त रूप में सामने लाती है, तो सांख्य दर्शन में उसका एक लंबा, जो उसकी लंबी विधि है, उसको समझाया गया है. उस विधि में न जाते हुए हम बस मूल रूप से इस चीज पे केंद्रित रहें. ये प्रकृति के 3 गुण हैं, और वो 3 गुण हैं सतोगुण, रजोगुण और तमोगुण हैं. और अभी जैसा प्रोफेसर कुंदन जी ने बताया कि हम इस पे अगर बस सिर्फ इस पे केंद्रित रहें, ये गुण जो हैं ये मूल हैं हमारे वर्ण के हैं, क्योंकि ये गुण ही प्रेरित करते हैं हमारे स्वधर्म को, उसको निर्धारित करते हैं, उससे हम अपने कर्म का चुनाव करते हैं, और उससे फिर वर्ण व्यवस्था, पुराने प्राचीन वैदिक काल में इस तरीके की व्यवस्था चारों तरफ हमारे यहाँ स्थापित थी है. आपने बताया कि श्री अरबिंदो ने कैसे बहुत अच्छे से समझाया है, और उसके बाद प्रोफेसर कुंदन जी ने बताया कि उन्होंने और गहन अध्ययन किया और शास्त्रों का, जिसमें से गौतम सूत्र हैं, गौतम धर्म सूत्र हैं, और भी जो हमारे वेदों में इसका वर्णन है, भगवत गीता में है, और भी कई जगह इसका वर्णन आता है. और दूसरा इन्होंने बताया कि अपनी स्वेच्छा से बाद में जब लोग अपने अलग कर्म का चुनाव करते थे, तो धीरे धीरे उनका वर्ण कुछ पीढ़ियों के बाद वो बदल जाता था, इसका भी वर्णन आता है। कितने पीढ़ी के बाद बदलता था, इसको भी उन्होंने बताया। ब्राह्मणों का कितनी पीढ़ी के बाद, है ना, वैश्यों का, क्षत्रियों का, शूद्रों का है। तो मूल रूप से ये अवधारणा हमारे यहाँ थी, ये वर्ण व्यवस्था थी। आपने बताया कि जैसे भगवान कृष्ण ने कहा है गीता में कि चातुर्वर्ण्यम मया सृष्टि, यानी कि और गुण कर्म विभागश। तो कैसे उन्होंने बताया कि ये चार जो वर्ण हैं, ये मूल रूप से ये उसके विषय में उन्होंने समझाया है। अब यहाँ तक तो बहुत ही अच्छे से समझाया प्रोफेसर कुंदन ने। अब हम जानना चाहेंगे कि कैसे अंग्रेजों ने, ब्रिटिशर्स ने, कैसे हमारी वर्ण व्यवस्था को पूरी तरीके से उन्होंने विकृत कर दिया, उन्होंने कैसे डिस्टॉर्ट कर दिया, और कैसे कास्ट को, कास्टिसिज्म को हमारे ऊपर उन्होंने थोप दिया, आरोपित कर दिया। सो प्रोफेसर कुंदन, नाउ वी आर गोइंग टू टॉक अबाउट, आई एम गोइंग टू आस्क यू द नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, दैट हाउ वाज दिस beautiful, Varna Vyavastha of Bharat was totally misunderstood. Purposely, it was distorted by the British. Can you just enlighten us on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And for that, I will take you to this academic book which I have written. It's called Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. And in this particular book, there are 6 chapters. I won't go into the details of the 6 chapters. In fact, I won't even go into the details of the first 2 chapters. I will stay focused on chapters 3 and 4. With this caveat and with this statement that this book is important, for all the people who are interested in India and Hinduism studies. So though it's been written, specifically for, or rather addressing the problems of the Indian American children, the 4 chapters of this book, the first 4 chapters of this book, will be relevant to all people who are interested in India and Hinduism studies. Having said that, I'm coming to chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is titled as Primitivizing the Hindus, and chapter 4 is titled Imagining the Hindus and Hinduism. Now, there was a particular point in time when this distortion became institutionalized. So the misrepresentation of this tradition has been happening ever since the Europeans set their foot on India. So we all know that, during the times of the Vijayanagar Empire, some Europeans had visited, so you had the Spanish people, the Spanish travelers coming to India. You also had the Italians, and they have left their records. And even there, you find that the understanding was not proper. Number one, they used to call the Hindu people derisively as heathens. This term is massively used. And the distortion in their narrative comes from the fact that they had the caste system in their own society, which was massively strong. And the caste system that they had was a very inflexible system. Even today, we use the term cast in stone. So the understanding was that that whatever family or whatever profession that you are born into, that is set for life. That cannot change. And they had a very strong caste system. So the Europeans, in many different ways, they have been misrepresenting the system right from the very beginning. But let's come to this part of the story where this narrative, this distortion became institutionalized and was made a part of the Indian fabric. And in order to understand this, we need to look into the writings of James Mill, who wrote the history of British India. The history of British India uh, came out in 1817 in 3 volumes. Who was this individual, James Mill? In order to understand this distortion, it is very, very significant to understand this individual, James Mill, because he has played a very crucial role, and we will get into why his role is extremely crucial. So James Mill was born in Scotland. He was born in 1773, came from a very humble background. His family had shoe selling and shoemaking business. However, his mother came from a background which was aristocratic in the past. There was an uprising in 1740s that had taken place in Scotland, which goes by the name of Stuart Uprising. And in Stuart Uprising, James Mill's grandfather, maternal grandfather, had participated, and he was defeated in that uprising. And when he was defeated, the aristocracy was taken away, and the family, fell into very humble times. James Mill's mother, rightly, had the knowledge of this background. So when James Mill was born to her, she wanted to regain aristocracy through this individual. So she made up her mind that James Mill would not take up the family business. So she was very focused on getting this person educated. And James Mill, interestingly, was a very precocious child. So what happened was that because of his precocity, he got noticed by the local stewards, by the local aristocrats, the stewards, interestingly, who started financing his education. So James Mill went for his bachelor's and master's in divinity studies at University of Edinburgh. And these studies were completed in 1797. This also happened because the lady steward, she wanted to make James Mill a preacher. So James Mill, after he completed his master's in divinity studies, he looked for the job of a preacher for the next 5 years, but he was not able to find a permanent job. So in 1802, he decided to move to London and become a journalist. Now, while he was trying to support himself, within this period from 1797 to 1802, he was teaching the children of aristocrats, and he had some very humiliating experiences. So in 1802, he comes to London and he starts a journalistic career. And as a part of his journalistic career, he starts manning the India desk for one of the journals. And by then, Praveerji, if you would remember, Asiatic Society had already been formed in Kolkata in 1784. And many of the Indian texts were getting very systematically translated, and they were coming to Britain. There were other Europeans who were also writing travelogues and all kinds of stuff on India, because by then books on India were forming a good industry, if you will. This wasn't the times of the radios and the TVs. So people basically kept themselves entertained by by reading books. So this was, this was a thriving industry, and all these translations and travelogues and other things from India, were coming into Europe. And for the profession in which James Mill was involved, uh, James Mill was writing their reports, you know, journalistic reports. So by the time it was 1806, he thought that he would write a very comprehensive document on India. He would write the history of British India, and the agenda was very clear. He wanted to create a governance manual for the East India Company. And James Mill, he took 12 years to basically produce this book. And in 1808, he had a chance meeting with this individual called Jeremy Bentham. And it is very important, to understand the uh, this connection, because Jeremy Bentham and some other people whom we will be discussing, as we move forward, have had a profound influence on the transformation of the European society. In fact, the rise of the left. The rise of the left can actually be traced to Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was about 35 years elder to James Mill. And Jeremy Bentham came from an aristocratic background. He was educated at Queen's College, which is part of the Oxford University. His father wanted him to become a lawyer. He was trained as a lawyer, but very similar to what happened with James Mill, his legal profession did not take off, and he took to writing. And Jeremy Bentham was a sensitive kind of an individual. He was looking at the British society at that point in time, which was extremely hierarchical and oppressive. Extremely hierarchical and oppressive, because the power was shared by a select group of people coming from monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy. Very small group of people who were wielding tremendous amount of power over the masses. The people literally had no say in governance. And this society, mind you, was massively divided on caste lines. And these castes were extremely fixed. So by the time it was 1780s, Jeremy Bentham started writing, and he produced some good pieces of work. Now, the unfortunate problem with Jeremy Bentham was that he was sage-like, number one, and number two, his writings were very detailed and very nuanced. So his writings were not able to reach the masses. So when this chance meeting happened between James Mill and Jeremy Bentham, a very interesting situation emerged, which was, here was a master. James Mill considered himself as a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, whose writings were very nuanced and difficult, who began to have a disciple who was a journalist. So what James Mill started doing was that he started simplifying the ideas of Jeremy Bentham and began taking them to the masses through his journalistic writings. And while he was doing this, he was also writing the history of British India. So you have two sets of writings when you look at the bibliography of James Mill. His writings centered on transforming the British society, which was extremely hierarchical and oppressive and divided along caste lines, and India specific writings where he has derided the Hindu civilization like no other. In the first volume of the history of British India, there are 7 chapters on the Hindu people. When you will go through those 7 chapters, his agenda was very, very clear. He wanted to show the Hindu people as hierarchical and oppressive. But before that, he wanted to show the Hindu people as primitive, as savage, as uncivilized, as brute, as uncouth. Take any synonym of savagery, and you will find that applied on the Hindu people in his descriptions. His descriptions are littered with these terms. And in order to show the Hindu people as primitive and uncivilized, he began to talk about the Hindu people as hierarchical and oppressive. And this is where, he begins using our Varna categories. So when you place, his India writings next to his British writings, you find exact correspondence between, what he's saying about the Brahmins and what he's saying about clergy. Exact correspondence between what he's saying about the aristocrats and what he's saying about the Kshatriyas. Exact correspondence, between what he's saying about the merchants of Britain and what he's saying about the Vaishyas. And exact correspondence between what he says about the Shudra people and the enslaved masses. So what happened was that there was a massive projection which was superimposed on this narrative or on this discourse that James Mill created and published in 1817. But the real story happened after the publication of the History of British India. The History of British India became widely known. It began selling as hotcakes. And very soon, he came in the notice of the East India officials. So he was hired by the East India Company in 1819 as a high official. And by the time it was 1823, James Mill was second in command in the hierarchy of officials operating from India House, which was the headquarters of the East India Company. East India Company at that point in time had 4 divisions. Revenue, was one of the departments. James Mill started overseeing the revenue department. By the time it was 1830, James Mill became the chief at India House. In a certain sense, you can say that he became the CEO of the East India Company. Why I'm saying that he became the CEO of the East India Company? Because if you look at the hierarchy which was prevalent there, above him, you only had a court of directors, with a president who was supposed to be a British parliamentarian. So that was the kind of hierarchy that James Mill became part of. and he began to wield a tremendous influence on India with respect to what happened consequently. People talk about Macaulay and the writings of Macaulay, and the discourse on Macaulay has become very, very popular. My contention is that, and I do not know whether we'll have time to go into that or not. My contention is that Macaulay would not have happened if James Mill would not have happened. James Mill is far more devious than Macaulay. What Macaulay did was basically what James Mill intended through his discourse, and there's history behind it. But that is for some time later. Today we are just going to talk about the discourse. So this discourse on Hindus, deriding the castes of the Hindus and so on and so forth, became institutionalized through the work of James Mill. James Mill, within the British context, is a very, very important figure. And unfortunately, he's not well known. And the reason is because he got sequestered between two greats, Jeremy Bentham, who was his mentor, and his own son, John Stuart Mill, who is considered as the father of liberalism. So basically, you have the father of utilitarianism and you have the father of liberalism, and in between is James Mill, who has actually played a massive role in the transformation of the British society, because it was predominantly through his work and a select group of people who were around him and Bentham who were able to bring reforms in British Parliament with respect to democracy or representational governance. And that happened in 1832. Before 1832, in the European context, there was no democracy worth the name. And this parliamentary reform happened because of the work of James Mill and some other utilitarians who were also called radicals within the European context. Now these guys, they also established University of London in 1825. So all these pieces of writing that James Mill had engaged in began to become institutionalized. They became part of the academic discourse. All subsequent historians, whether in Europe or in India, have followed the paradigm which was set forth by James Mill. Soon after, Cambridge University and Oxford University became interested in writing the history of India, and there also, you find very deep correspondence between what is written in these books and what James Mill wrote. And then when institutions began to get formed in India 1850 onwards, this discourse began to become an integral part of the Indian thought process. And now, it is everywhere. It's basically the discourse of James Mill, which you find in books across the board.
So that's very, very informative, very, very, enlightening, as you said. Many people don't know about this. So you say that, the father of all these distortions, the James Hill is the father of all these distortions, which are so prevalent now. And even the Macaulay, he took thoughts from his works.
Yeah.
Can you specifically point out few things, few terms, few catchphrases that James Hill he coined or he came up with in his works when he wrote the history of British India?
Let me actually, read something. Just give me a minute. I should be able to find it. This is the he's extremely derisive, extremely derisive. When he's talking about the Hindu people. I just found one thing uh, at random, and I'm going to read that. This is what he writes in the history of British India. The offspring of a wild and ungoverned imagination, they mark the state of a rude and credulous people, whom the marvelous delights, who cannot estimate the use of a record of past events. This is when he's describing the Hindu people as people who do not have a sense of history. He is the one who created this prejudice, which much later got institutionalized, and it hasn't gone away even now. It's still prevalent. And whose imagination the real occurrences of life are too familiar to engage. To the monstrous period of years which the legends of the Hindus involve, they ascribe events the most extravagant and unnatural, events not even connected in chronological series, a number of independent and incredible fictions. This people, indeed, are perfectly destitute of historical records. And there's more. Maybe we can have a full discussion on this. And at that point in time, I will bring you these specific quotes. But this Hindu phobia that you experience, while it was prevalent, earlier also, James Mill is the fault line where it became institutionalized. Because this discourse got picked up in the European society, both by the left and the right. The missionaries started reflecting, very similar kind of discourse. And of course, they got the license to do anything what they wanted 1813 onwards. Before that, the East India Company was not allowing the missionaries. But in 1813, there was a charter that was passed, and they became active in India. They were very quick, to latch on to this discourse that James Mill created, and started perpetuating it in the Indian society at will. Now let me share with you what transpired, between Mill and Macaulay, because this is an interesting story that your viewers need to know. Macaulay was much younger, to Mill. And if you look at the political divisions in Britain in their times, whereas James Mill belonged to the left, Macaulay belonged to the right. So I was telling you that James Mill, because of the transformation that he was seeking, he wrote many journal articles, in various journals in Britain. So one of the journal articles was titled "Government," and in that particular article, James Mill went hammer and tongs against the aristocrats. And Macaulay, interestingly, had a background both in clergy as well as aristocracy. And despite the fact that he was much younger, he was closer in age to John Stuart Mill, he wrote a scathing rebuttal of James Mill's article called The Government. And this was the beginning of Macaulay's popularity. However, when the India Bill was getting discussed, either in 1830 or 31, I don't exactly remember, which year it was, but very, very close to either of these 2 years, Macaulay, to make a case for himself, quoted James Mill extensively as far as his India writings are concerned. After the passage of the India Bill, it was decided that there would be a superior council which would be established in Kolkata. Superior council consisting of 3 members. The caveat was that none of them could actually have any connection with the East India Company. Macaulay was interested in that position, and he got that position. In one of the letters that I believe he wrote to his sister, he stated that if he did not get that position, it would be because of James Mill. And he describes James Mill as the arch enemy. But you will be surprised that the appointment of Macaulay to Superior Council was recommended by James Mill himself. It was James Mill who brought Macaulay to Superior Council. And that is why, I keep saying this, that the Christian right and the political left, or even the political right of the West, are united in undermining Hindus and Hinduism. It will not matter, and it doesn't matter even now, which party or which persuasion is active in any of the Western countries. They will be joined to the hip in going after the Hindus. This is what the history is. As I told you, in the domestic political context, Macaulay and Mill were on the 2 ends of the political spectrum. They were arch enemies. But Macaulay's appointment to Superior Council was recommended by James Mill, and we all know what Macaulay did after he came to India. Where did his knowledge on India come from? From the writings of James Mill and the history of British India. And this is just one example. There are so many other things that have happened. And that is why I say that it is very important to take discourse very seriously. Because discourse has profound capacity of changing terrestrial conditions.
Absolutely.
भारत की डेस्टिनी इन लोगों ने मिलकर के बदल दी, and it emanates from discourse. Discourse preceded what happened in Bharat afterwards.
And even today, Hindus have not learned from this, Professor Kundan. अगर आप देखिए, हिंदुओं ने सीखा नहीं इससे.
बिल्कुल नहीं सीखा.
आज भी हम सीरियसली नहीं ले रहे डिस्कोर्सेस को. आज भी वही चीजें और एक अपने विभत्स और एक भयानक स्वरूप में चारों तरफ दिख रही हैं. आपने जैसा बताया कि हिंदू आज आप देखिए पूरे विश्व में जिस तरीके से दिन प्रतिदिन हिंदू फोबिया, हिंदू हेट्रेड, हिंदू मीसिया बढ़ता जा रहा है. और आपने अभी जैसा बताया कि इसका तो सबका पितामह जो है वो मिल था.
Right.
और उसने देखिए जो चीजें लिखी हैं वो आज भी एकेडमिया में, वेस्टर्न एकेडमिया में कैसे पूरी तरीके से व्याप्त हैं, उसी नक्शे पे ये लोग चल रहे हैं। और हिंदूज कुछ हैं, हिंदू ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस तो इस दिशा में कार्य बहुत अच्छा कर रहे हैं, लेकिन बाय एंड लार्ज एक बहुत बड़ी संख्या है हिंदुओं की, पूरे विश्व में 120 करोड़ हिंदुओं की, उन्होंने अभी इन चीजों को समझा नहीं है। आपसे ये परिचर्चा करने का उद्देश्य ये था, और यही है कि हम इन सबके जो मूल है उस पे जाए। अनलेस वी नो, यू नो, द कोर ऑफ ऑल दिस, अनलेस वी नो द कॉज, अनलेस वी नो द पीपल बिहाइंड ऑल दिस, यू नो, वी कैन नॉट क्योर दिस प्रॉब्लम है। तो हम सब लोग प्रॉब्लम्स की बात करते हैं, हम सिम्टम्स की बात करते हैं, लेकिन मूल में क्या है, बीमारी क्या है, क्या उसको कैसे हम समझें, कैसे हम फिर उसका उपचार करें, ये बहुत ही आवश्यक था। इसीलिए हमने कहा ये चर्चा करते हैं। और ये बहुत बढ़िया आपने बताया, क्योंकि आज जो है पूरे विश्व में जो एक चारों तरफ एक चुनौती है हिंदुओं के लिए पूरे विश्व में, उसको समझना बहुत आवश्यक है, क्योंकि अलग-अलग जो फोर्सेस हैं, वो हमें टारगेट कर रही हैं। कई फोर्सेस आपस में मिल के हमें टारगेट कर रही हैं। अगर हम इसको नहीं समझेंगे, अगर हम संगठित नहीं होंगे, अगर हम इस इनसे बहुत स्ट्रैटेजिकली अगर हम नहीं युद्ध करेंगे वैचारिक रूप में, तो आने वाले समय में ये चुनौतियाँ एक बहुत बड़ा संकट लेके आएँगी हमारी अगली पीढ़ी के लिए। इसलिए इनको समझना बहुत ही आवश्यक है। आपने बहुत ही बढ़िया समझाया। प्लीज़ अब आगे बढ़ें आप। प्लीज़
जी,
कंटिन्यू।
इसमें मैं एक आध दो बात और कहना चाहता हूँ कि देखिए, एक तो हुआ कि डिस्कोर्स हुआ, राइट, डिस्कोर्स इसने बनाया। अब साइमल्टेनियसली एक और चीज हो रही थी, and I'll switch back to English, for your Hindi viewers, maybe you can give a synopsis later. So so this discourse got created, right, and simultaneously these people, they started exploiting India in a very big way, right, and they started attacking uh, the industries that were prevalent and all kinds of occupations that the Indian people had, the Hindu people had, right? And even till the times that you know uh, James Mill started his practice, the understanding that your Varna is dependent on your occupation was fairly common in the Hindu people. So when jobs started getting taken away, right, people started doing the karma of other varnas, and gradually, the population started sliding down. More and more people started doing the karma of the Shudra category. They started getting involved in the karmas of the Shudra people. And because of that, their varnas also began to change. And then simultaneously, what these guys also did was that they started co-opting different jatis from different parts of India, for their own political purposes. And this system, which was very amorphous and loose and flexible, began to become stratified and hierarchical. So it was not only just the discourse, it was also the practices that they engaged in. So, like for instance, in Tamil Nadu, they co-opted the Iyer community. Even amongst the Brahmins, the Iyers were co-opted. Why were the Iyers co-opted and not the Iyengars? the Ayers are smartas. They are smart Brahmins. What does that term mean? They were experts of the Smriti tradition. So the Smarta Brahmins were required by the Britishers to extend their control over the Hindu people. So certain families, I would not say all the people, from the Ayer community got co-opted, but certain families got co-opted. And they became part of, the British machinery. They started pushing, the zamindari system as well. Let's come to Andhra Pradesh. The Reddys and Kammas were co-opted, for all the land, quote unquote, land reforms that took place. In UP, certain families, some certain select families from the Brahman Jati got co-opted. In Bihar, certain select families, from the Brahman Bhumiyar community got co-opted. So, the historians talk about the divide and rule that has been played, between the Hindus and the Muslims, by the British. The real story is that the divide and rule has actually been played amongst the Hindu community. It is through this selective co-option and encouraging them that that this disharmony amongst the jatis that you find in India. There is another point, which needs to be clarified, at this point in time. The difference between the Shudras and the category which is known as Asprishya. There is a lot of fog and misconception around this particular issue. And that is the reason, it becomes extremely important to visit the Smriti tradition. The Smriti tradition does mention, the category of Asprishyata. But most people, Praveenji, 99.99% Hindus, in fact, do not have an understanding of how Asprishyata came into existence. उनको जानकारी नहीं है इस बात की. And I'm going to, shed some light on this. Now, in order to understand this, it becomes extremely important to understand two kinds of unions, two kinds of marriages that happened in Hindu India. One goes by the category of Anulom Vivah, and the other goes by the category of Pratilom Vivah. What was Anulom Vivah? I'll give you an example. Anulom Vivah was when a Brahman Purush married either a Brahman Stri, a Kshatriya Stri, or a Vaishya Stri, or a Shudra Stri. Similarly, a Vaishya Purush married a Vaishya Stri or a Shudra Stri. These kinds of unions or marriages were allowed. Antarvarniya Vivah, intervarna marriages were allowed in Hindu India. And the Smriti tradition, actually talks about the categories of progenies that would be born of such unions. It has described them in great detail. Now let me give you an example of a Pratilom Vivah. What was a Pratilom Vivah? A Pratilom Vivah happened when a Brahmin Stri, a Brahmin woman, married either a Shudra man, or a Vaishya man, or a Kshatriya man. Now, the people who engaged, in Pratilom Vivah and their progenies, they were thrown out of the fourfold order, consisting of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. They were thrown out of the fourfold order. They lived on the fringes of the society, in between, two human settlements. It could be between villages, or it could be between a village and a kasbah, or between a kasbah and a town, and so on and so forth. So the term that that you also find for the people against whom asprishata or untouchability was practiced as antyaj. They were existing on the fringes of the society. So let me go back, to this. The people who engaged in Pratilom Vivah and their progenies were thrown out of the fourfold order, against whom asprishata was practiced. And as I told you, I have very clear evidence from Gautam Dharma Sutra, where it is also stated very candidly and categorically that people who would engage in a social discourse with the people who had been banished from the society would also become untouchables. Now, the Brahmins who engaged in criminal activities, because the system, because the Raja could not give corporeal punishment, to the Brahmins, were also thrown out of the society, out of the fourfold order, with cut marks on their noses and ears. Naak kaan kaat lete the. Aaj bhi prevalent hai. Naak kata diya, kaan kata diya. It's very much this phrase is very prevalent in northern India, for sure. They were banished, out of the fourfold order, and cut marks were made, on certain body parts, so that they could not be reintegrated into the society. Against this category also untouchability was practiced. Asprishata was practiced. So what was that system? That system, whatever their understanding was, every society runs on certain social codes and morals. I'm not justifying this, but what I'm saying is, and I'm very categorically saying this, I'm not justifying this practice, but what I'm saying is that this is how it happened. The space outside the fourfold order was basically an open prison house. It was an open prison house where, your right to food would not be taken away, your right to sunlight would not be taken away, your right to air would not be taken away, your right to movement would not be taken away, and your right also to work would not be taken away. Now let me give you, a couple of examples. The union from a Brahmin Stree, or progenies, born from the union of a Brahmin woman and a Kshatriya man, were called Sutas. They were Sut. Now it is not that, that Suts were not given work by the society. They were given work by the society, but they did not they did not live as a part of the fourfold order. They were outside of the society. Similarly, where does this category of Chandal come from? Chandalas were those people born out of the union of a Brahmin woman with a Shudra Purush. Now, the massive problem with this situation was that the progenies were never reintegrated back into the society. That never happened. Once people were banished out of the society, there was no way of re-entry. Now, all the four Varnas, they coexisted. Like, for instance, if you go into the Arthashastra literature, and I've read Kautilya's Arthashastra very, very carefully, you find that the Brahmins would live in the north of a settlement. The Vaishyas, the artisans, they would live on the south side. The Kshatriyas on the east side. And the Shudras on the west side. In fact, all the cities of the Harappan civilization, Praveenji, you will be excited to know this, and so will be your viewers, show artisan activity in the south side of the cities. So this was what the system was. One can pronounce on whether it was right or wrong. That's a different matter. But this is how untouchability came into existence. Most people do not know about it. And what has happened is that under the influence of this current discourse, the untouchable category, and I do not feel good, talking about these terms, and the Shudra category have been conflated. Ek Dalit ka naam de diya gaya hai. But if you really look at it, if you look at it from these categories, from the Dharma Shastra perspective, there are two different categories. And because, within the Hindu society, there were very few people who violated the social mores. Even today, technically, and once again, I do not feel good about, talking about this. Technically, you will find the population of people falling into the category of the untouchable people, very, very small. Very, very small. And in my understanding, this is the only population which actually deserves reservation. Just this population. Everybody else within the Hindu society, has been exploited by the Britishers massively. Major exploitation has actually happened. And if people want to ask for reparation, they should basically go to the British, the British people, the Britishers. The Hindus are not responsible for this. And this, this understanding needs to become very, very clear. It is the Britishers who actually made the majority of the population extremely poor, and co-opted certain families from certain jati groups and created the kind of situation that we are in. You find poor people coming from all sections of the society. all sections of the society. We all know that there are extremely poor people within the Brahmin community. There are extremely poor people, within the Kshatriya community. Extremely poor people in the category which goes by the name of the general category. And there are extremely rich people, you know, uh, falling in some other categories. And and I will be very sorry to say this. No political party across the spectrum in India is free from caste politics. And
You're
there's
right.
no political
Absolutely.
party, there's no political party, which is willing to which is going to spend time and energy in understanding what that system was and what the Britishers actually did, during the colonial period when it came to, tinkering with the Jati configuration. Nobody is interested.
Correct.
And therefore,
Absolutely.
and see what happens is that the level playing field will have to be created. If we want the progress of Bharat, when the level playing field will get created, people out of their own choice, out of their own merit, out of by the dint of their own hard work, they will choose the profession that they get attracted to. Guna, is the cosmological reality. If we want to progress, the vocations, the occupations will have to get created, it will have to get linked with gunas once again. And what is the best way to do it? Create a level playing field. If one is interested in studying, if one is interested in pursuing knowledge, against all odds that individual will rise and pick that vocation. If one wants to become a warrior, from all sections of the society, one will join the defense services. So, unless this level playing field happens, and for this reason, I'm very candid in saying this, and I'm saying this, after having done a lot of research. Apart from the category of people against whom, untouchability was practiced, and we get that, from the Smriti tradition, nobody deserves reservation. Maybe, very controversial what I'm saying, but this is what the reality is. ये knowledge यही show करता है. This is what emerges from research, and the divine knows that that I have systematically applied myself in understanding this. And every statement that I have made, I can actually back it, uh, with credible evidence.
Absolutely. You see, what you're saying is not only controversial, it is going to turn everything upside down. And what you said is so right. कोई भी राजनीतिक पार्टी इससे पृथक नहीं है, अलग नहीं है इस कास्ट के, है ना, इस माया जाल से है. ये जानबूझ के क्रिएट किया गया है, और अब तो मतलब सबको एक इसी का एक माध्यम मिल गया है वोट देने का, बटोरने का. इसलिए कोई
Pravinji, you have frozen. There's a live feed, so which is still going on. So what I'll do is that I will fill in for Praveenji till he joins. So yes, so what I was saying is, and it's coming from very extensive research which I have done, that apart from people against whom traditionally uh, untouchability has been practiced, and that evidence comes from the Smriti tradition, no other population actually deserves reservation, because all the sections of the society were impoverished by British exploitation and British misrule. And mind you, as long as the Hindu society was active, Varna was dependent on the occupation that one had. And the whole idea, was for people to practice different occupations and exist with one another. I just got a message from Praveenji. He says that there's some technical glitch and he will be joining back in a moment. So I'm holding the space. He is joining back.
There was a technical glitch. I'm back here.
Yes, I held the space for you. I spoke to your viewers.
Oh, wonderful! That's very nice. So coming back on what I was saying, the purpose of this entire discussion and the series of this podcast that I'm having with you on Varna and caste is this: no political party is going to do anything. This we have to bring about an awareness. This has to come, from the aware citizens. It has to come from the civil society. It is, the responsibility of all of us to come together and eradicate all these whatever narratives which have been there for such a long time, which everybody has exploited, right from the colonizers, Britishers, to the political dispensations of our country. So we should not allow this to happen. The purpose of education is this, to bring about awareness. The purpose for me to start Prachyam was this, that I wanted, to put forth the true narratives of Bharat. And what we have discussed today is actually the true narrative. You have gone in the core of everything. बहुत अच्छे से आपने समझाया कि मूल हमारी सभ्यता, हमारी संस्कृति कैसी थी, क्या उल्लेख मिलता है हमें प्राचीन शास्त्रों में, हमारे वेदों में और आगे के ग्रंथों में। आपने बहुत अच्छे से समझाया इसको, और यही उद्देश्य है हमारा कि हम एक नव जागृति उत्पन्न करें विश्व में। जितने भी भारतीय हैं, हिंदू हैं, उनमें अगर हम ये नहीं करेंगे तो ऐसे ही अलग अलग लोग, चाहे वो पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज हों, चाहे वो विश्व के अन्य देश हों और सोसाइटीज हों, सभ्यताएं हों, वो सब हमें इसी तरीके से टारगेट करती रहेंगी, एक्सप्लॉइट करती रहेंगी, जैसे कि अब विश्व में आप देख रहे हैं हो रहा है, जैसे हिंदू फोबिया बढ़ता जा रहा है। इसलिए ये हमारी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है कि हम संगठित हो जाएं, हम सजग हों, सचेत हों, सही ज्ञान से सशक्त हों और सावधान होके आगे बढ़ें, क्योंकि इन सब चीज़ों को हम ही को सही करना है। और प्राच्यम मैं चाहता हूँ कि इस दिशा में बहुत समय से काम कर रहा है और हम निरंतर इस तरीके से हम आगे बढ़ते रहेंगे, अपने कर्तव्य को पूर्ण करते रहेंगे। प्राच्यम विश्व का पहला भारतीय सनातनी धार्मिक ओटीटी प्लेटफॉर्म है। ये जितने भी भारतीय हैं, सनातनी हैं, धार्मिक लोग हैं विश्व में, उनकी ये एक बहुत ही स्ट्रॉन्ग एक वॉइस है। और इसीलिए हम चाहते हैं कि इस इंडिक रिवॉल्यूशन से जो प्राच्यम लेके आ रहा है, सब लोग जुड़े हैं। आज बहुत ही बढ़िया डिस्कशन था, लेकिन ये डिस्कशन अभी कंप्लीट नहीं हुआ है प्रोफेसर कुंदन सिंह जी। हम इस डिस्कशन को नेक्स्ट एपिसोड में आगे इसको वैसे ही निरंतर आगे बढ़ाएंगे, क्योंकि अभी हमें बहुत सी बातें करनी है। अभी हमें कहाँ से कास्ट आया ये शब्द, कैसे हमारे ऊपर मढ़ा गया अंग्रेजों ने, कैसे हमने उसको यथार्थ मान लिया, कैसे हमने कभी भी उसका प्रतिरोध नहीं किया, कैसे आज भी ये सब डिस्टॉर्शंस और फॉल्स नैरेटिव्स हमारे चारों तरफ हैं, प्रिवेलेंट हैं इतनी तेजी से, और तेजी से बढ़ते जा रहे हैं। कैसे ऑडियो विजुअल मीडियम को, सोशल मीडिया को ये लोग एक माध्यम बना के, एक टूल बना के हमारे युवाओं को भी दिग्भ्रमित कर रहे हैं। इसलिए ये बहुत आवश्यक है। अंत में मैं तो यही कहूंगा कि अगर भारत को विश्व गुरु बनना है
जी।
वास्तविक रूप में, तो हमें इन सब, जितनी भी ये दुनिया भर के हम देख रहे हैं, ये जो झूठ है, ये जो गलत नैरेटिव्स हैं, ये जो आपस में विभेद हमने हमने पैदा कर दिया है, जो पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज ने हमारे मन में ये सब बीज बो दिए हैं, हमें इन सब के परे जाना होगा। तभी हमारा जो समाज है, हमारी जो संस्कृति है, वो पुनर्जागृत हो पाएगी, पुनर्संस्थापित हो पाएगी, और तभी अनादिकाल से जो था भारत वास्तविक रूप में विश्व गुरु था, तभी वो विश्व गुरु बन पाएगा। प्रोफेसर कुंदन जी, आपसे अंत में अगर आप कुछ कहना चाहें तो आप कहें, नहीं तो हम इस परिचर्चा को अपने अगले एपिसोड में ऐसे ही कंटिन्यू रखेंगे।
जी, मैं सिर्फ दो छोटी सी बात कहूँगा। पहली बात तो ये है कि कोई भी सोसाइटी तभी प्रोग्रेस करेगी जब वहाँ सोशल हार्मनी होगा, और ये सोशल हार्मनी को हम स्पिन नहीं दे रहे हैं। ये सोशल हार्मनी हमारे सोसाइटी में थी, उस सोशल हार्मनी को हटाया गया है, और अगर हम वापस जाएंगे, हम वापस से एक दूसरे के साथ हारमोनियस होंगे, एक दूसरे के साथ सामंजस्य बिठाएंगे, तभी हम आगे बढ़ेंगे। और जो मैं जिस कास्ट डिस्कोर्स के बारे में हम लोग तो डेफिनेटली बात करेंगे, मैं आपको ये भी कह रहा था कि इस किताब को हम लोगों ने ओपन एक्सेस बनाया है। ये एकेडमिक पब्लिकेशन है, लेकिन इसको ओपन एक्सेस बनाया है क्योंकि एकेडमिक पब्लिकेशन वेस्ट के जो होते हैं वो बहुत एक्सपेंसिव हो जाते हैं और लोग अफोर्ड नहीं कर पाते हैं। और मैं ये नहीं चाहता था कि ये किताब जो है वो सिर्फ जा कर के लाइब्रेरी शेल्व्स में बैठे और कुछ सेलेक्ट लोग इसके बारे में पढ़ें, क्योंकि इसका उद्देश्य बहुत डिफरेंट था। तो मैं आपके व्यूअर्स को ये कहूँगा कि वो स्प्रिंगर के वेबसाइट पे जाएं, colonial discourse and the suffering of Indian American children को टाइप करें। उनको दो लिंक मिलेंगे, जिसमें कि PDF फॉर्म में ये पूरी किताब डाउनलोड हो जाएगी और किंडल वर्जन भी इसका पूरा डाउनलोड हो जाएगा। और अगर वो पूरी किताब नहीं पढ़ना चाहते हैं, चैप्टर्स 5 और 6 उनके लिए अगर रेलेवेंट नहीं है, तो पहले 4 चैप्टर्स जो है उसको पढ़ें। और पहले 4 चैप्टर्स जो हैं वो हमारी सभ्यता को वापस अपने रूट से कनेक्ट करने के लिए और आगे बढ़ाने के लिए ये बहुत ही हेल्पफुल होगा। मैंने 3.5 साल तक बहुत ही फोकस्ड रिसर्च किया है, और मैं ये क्रेडिट नहीं ले रहा हूँ, मैं ये भगवान का बहुत बड़ा ग्रेस, अपने गुरु का ग्रेस मानता हूँ जिसके कारण ये हुआ है। और मैं ये चाहता हूँ कि लोग इसको पढ़ करके वो जो एविडेंस मैंने जुटाए हैं वो देखें और एविडेंस के बेसिस पे अपने सोच को बदलें। तो मैं यही कहना चाहता था अंत में, और मैं आपका बहुत ही आभारी हूँ प्राच्यम के प्लेटफॉर्म पे बुलाया और आपने मुझे अपनी बातों को कहने का मौका दिया, शेयर करने का ये दिया अपॉर्चुनिटी, and we will continue this conversation. There are so many things that have to be shared. There's so many pieces of very beautiful information, knowledge coming from Sri Aurobindo, which incidentally has not become part of the Hindu tradition, which also needs to be shared. So we'll continue our conversation on all those scores, and I'm indeed grateful for this opportunity. So thank you.
No, not at all, Professor Kundan. I'm thankful that you spared time to come on our show, Unfiltered with Prachyam Live. हमने श्री अरविंदो एक स्वयं महान ऋषि थे. हमने उनका आशीर्वाद लेके हमने इस पॉडकास्ट को शुरू किया. हम उन्हीं के आशीर्वाद को, उन्हीं के अनुग्रह को की प्रार्थना करते हुए इस पॉडकास्ट को हम आज यहाँ पे विराम देंगे. श्री अरविंदो को आपने बहुत सही कहा कि स्वतंत्रता के बाद जो पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज रहीं, उन्होंने भी, वर्तमान पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज ने भी, किसी ने भी श्री अरविंदो को लोगों तक पहुंचाने का कोई प्रयास नहीं किया, काफ़ी नेग्लेक्ट किया. लेकिन जैसा कि हम लोग की बात हुई, हम लोग प्राच्यम के माध्यम से ये प्रयास करेंगे. ये मेरी हृदय से एक मेरी ये इच्छा है, एक प्रेरणा है, उन्हीं के द्वारा दी गई प्रेरणा है. प्राच्यम में एक सीरीज है द ग्रेट ऋषिज ऑफ भारत. उसी में हम चाहेंगे कि पूरी कई एपिसोड की सीरीज हम करें, वो निश्चित रूप से होगी. अंत में आपसे बस एक छोटा सा निवेदन है कि जाने के पहले प्राच्यम, जो कि विश्व का पहला भारतीय सनातनी धार्मिक ओटीटी प्लेटफॉर्म है, जिसमें 500 से अधिक हमने फिल्म, सीरीज, शोज, पॉडकास्ट हमने सब बनाए हैं. इतने उसमें टाइटल्स हैं. बच्चों के लिए प्राच्यम किड्स है और संगीत प्रेमियों के लिए प्राच्यम नाद है. अपनी महान संस्कृति को, अपनी अद्भुत जो ज्ञान की धाराएं हैं उनको, अपनी ऋषि परंपराओं को, अपनी ज्ञान विज्ञान दर्शन वाङ्मय को पुनः संस्थापित और संरक्षित करने की दिशा में ये एक हमारा प्रयास है, ये एक हमारा अनुष्ठान है. हम सबसे हमेशा निवेदन करते हैं, आह्वान करते हैं कि इस महानुष्ठान में जितने भी हिंदू हैं, पूरे जितने भी सनातनी हैं, जितने भी धार्मिक लोग हैं, वो जुड़ें और अपना सहयोग और हमें आशीर्वाद दें. आपसे बस यही निवेदन है कि जाने के पहले आपके जो भाव हैं, जो विचार हैं प्राच्यम के बारे में, आप वो अवश्य हमारे दर्शकों के साथ उसको साझा करें.
धन्यवाद. तो आप हाँ, मैं अभी देखने वाला हूँ. मुझे प्राच्यम के बारे में बहुत पहले से पता नहीं था. मैं सोशल मीडिया पर्सन नहीं हूँ एक्चुअली. मेरे पास एक्स अकाउंट नहीं है, ट्विटर नहीं है, इंस्टाग्राम नहीं है, क्योंकि, और ये डेलिबरेटली मैंने किया है क्योंकि मैं शोध में अपना वो समय जो है वो ज़्यादा व्यतीत करता हूँ. तो मैं मुझे ये पता लगा है और मैं सारे आपके जो प्रोग्राम्स हैं उनको मैं एक एक करके देखना शुरू करूँगा. और इनफैक्ट मैं आपको ये भी कहूँगा कि आने के पहले आपकी जो वार्ता प्रोफेसर झा से हुई है JNU की, मैंने उसको देखा है और जो है, और मैंने जो आपको कहा था कि जो हमारा डिस्कशन होगा वो कॉम्प्लीमेंट करेगा उनके इस डिस्कशन को. तो धीरे धीरे करके मैं जितने पॉडकास्ट हैं, जो आपके फिल्म्स हैं, आपके जो प्रोग्राम्स हैं, मैं उनको देखना शुरू करूँगा और हम लोगों का ये कोलैबोरेशन जो है वो जारी रहेगा, क्योंकि ये एक ईश्वर कार्य है और भारत का श्री अरबिंदो के दृष्टिकोण में एक बहुत ही स्पेशल प्लेस है. और जब लोग भारत से बाहर निकलते हैं और वो भारतीय संस्कृति क्या है वो और भी दिखने लगता है. मेरे साथ तो थोड़ा दूसरा हुआ था. श्री अरविंद ने मुझे पका करके वेस्ट में भेजा था. तो उनकी बहुत बड़ी कृपा हुई थी, असीम कृपा हुई थी. फाउंडेशंस ऑफ इंडियन कल्चर मैं यहाँ आने के पहले ही पढ़ चुका था. तो उनका जो भारत को ट्रांसफॉर्म करने का जो व्यू है और जो मल्टी साइडेड पर्सपेक्टिव उनका है, योग के बारे में, बाकी ट्रेडिशंस के बारे में, कैसे उन्होंने ट्रेडिशंस का सिंथेसिस किया है, इन सब के बारे में जानने के लिए, और वो किस तरह का रिकवरी चाह रहे हैं, वो कैसा रेनेसांस चाह रहे हैं इंडिया, उसके बारे में बात करना, कैसे इंडिया आगे बढ़ेगा और कैसे जो है वो वापस ये मैं जानता हूँ वेस्टर्न एकेडेमिया में इस पर्सपेक्टिव को जो है वो romantic perspective बोलते हैं, when we talk about the golden age, or when we talk about what we have accomplished in the ancient times, they say that it's a romantic inclination. It's not a romantic inclination. We truly were great in many different fields, not only in literature and darshan and philosophy and so on and so forth, but in material richness as well. It is very unfortunate that that we got impounded massively by our enemies for about 1,000 years, and we have come to this situation. But it can be, what has been lost can very well be regained. The thing is that that we Bharatiyas will have to apply ourselves in that direction. And yoga for what? Yoga for this internal purification, internal transmutation, and coming from that perspective. हम अगर हिंदू तभी होंगे जब हम अपने शास्त्रों को, हम अपने ट्रेडिशंस को समझेंगे और उसका क्रियान्वयन करेंगे. प्रवीण जी, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. अब तो पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज की बात हो रही थी. बहुत सारे हिंदूज भी जो हैं वो क्रियान्वयन के मामले में बहुत ही लिमिटेड हैं. उनकी थिंकिंग बहुत ही कॉलोनियल है, जो कि मेरे जैसे लोगों का कार्य को बहुत बुरे तरीके से इम्पीड किया है ओवर अ पीरियड ऑफ टाइम. वो भी क्या कहते हैं, वो भी परेशानी है. तो हमारी सभ्यता को, हमारी संस्कृति को, और हम ये चाहेंगे कि पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज अक्रॉस द ट्रेडिशन बातों को समझें और अपने आप को जो है वहां से बढ़ाएं. Political power can be gained through right means as well, by following the dharma. अधर्म के थ्रू पॉलिटिकल पावर को ग्रैब करना, वो हिंदू नहीं है. वो कुछ भी और हो सकता है, वो हिंदू नहीं है. वो हमारी संस्कृति को रिप्रेजेंट नहीं करता है. हमारे राजाओं का जो छत्र था, जिस छत्र की बात हम करते हैं, दैट कैनपी, वो क्या रिप्रेजेंट करता है? वो धर्म रिप्रेजेंट करता है. So with these thoughts, and as I said, I will be going through, I'm a researcher, a khadus researcher, if you will. So I am going to watch all your programs very, very systematically, and in our future conversations, we'll pick them up as well, cite them. And as I said, this podcast, I would say, should be seen as complementing the conversation that you had with Professor Jha on this very important issue.
Absolutely. And we will continue this wonderful discussion that we had, in the series of podcasts with you. Thank you so much for your time, and we shall meet very soon. Namaskar.
प्राच्यम का जो प्रयास है बहुत गौरव जगाने वाला है. 60 साल में हमने जो खोया उसको वापस लाने का काम कर रहे हैं.
Prachyam is doing an amazing job.
प्राच्यम का जो पुरुषार्थ है घर घर पहुंचे.
ऐसे अप्रतिम पुरुषार्थ के लिए मेरी अनंत शुभकामनाएं हैं.
Prachyam is doing an excellent job to give you knowledge which you don't get in school.